Mother, this is my partner. I brought her here tonight so you can formally meet the woman I have chosen to be with.
You can dress up for the dinner, but you can't hide your place. Holding a vintage Grand Cru by the bowl like a common street beggar. You see, money can buy you a dress, but it can never buy you class.
You don't belong in beauty! You will never belong in our world!
Diddy?
The Meridian private room does not appear on any public guest directory at the Ashford Grand Hotel. 24 chairs, white linen. Candlelight in silver cutlery, untouched since 7:53 p.m. Beaut. The air in the room held the specific quality of a space that had been dressed for an occasion, and was now waiting to find out what kind of occasion it had actually become. A string quartet was playing something quiet. Then it wasn't. Madame Yan Su-Kang set her chopsticks down without a sound. The way someone sets down a weapon, they no longer need to announce. She looked at the woman seated to her son's left, at the bracelet, at the back that had stayed straight through things this room would never understand. She spoke, quietly, which was worse. A woman who cannot manage her own appearance wants to sell beauty to others. I do not understand what my son believes he sees here. The string quartet stopped, not at the end of a phrase, in the middle of one. Somewhere near the kitchen, a server stopped mid-step. No one in the room moved first, not the two eldest members at the far end of the table. Not the three people who had known Madame Kang for 20 years and understood exactly how rarely she spoke at that volume in a room like this. Not one of them. Simone Adeyemi placed her water glass down. Slowly, there was nothing on her face that gave the room what it was waiting for. She had built an entire brand from that look. Then the door at the end of the hall opened. 17 minutes early. Before we go any further, if you found this story tonight, stay. Not just because of what happens next, though I promise you it is worth every second, but because this is the story of a woman who built something extraordinary from the exact sentence you just heard, and the man who walked through that door 17 minutes early, and what happened to 24 people who were certain they already knew how this night would end. Drop a DM in the comments right now if you already know that woman was stronger than every person in that room. And tell me where you're watching from, your city and your local time. I want to know who's here with me tonight. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. This story runs 6 parts and not one of them is optional. Stay with me. Let's go back to where it started 4 years before that dinner. The story does not begin in the Meridian private room. It begins on a Tuesday in April at 9:23 in the morning on the third floor of a building on Imlay Street in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, that smelled of shea butter and ethyl ester and the focused quiet of someone who had been at work since before most people had finished their coffee. But to understand what happened in that room, you need to understand who each of these 2 people had already become. Simone Adeyemi grew up in Accra, Ghana, the oldest of 4 children. Her father died when she was 13. Not dramatically, just one morning he was there and then he was not. And the family he left behind needed someone to hold it together. No one asked her to be that person. She picked up what was lying there and carried it. She came to the United States at 22 on an academic scholarship, studied business logistics in the day and formulation chemistry at night, and arrived at a 380-square-foot room in Bed-Stuy 5 years later with $11,400 in savings and one specific memory she had not been able to leave behind. She had been 19 years old, standing at a department store cosmetics counter with 5 different foundations against her wrist. Not one of them matched, not because she was choosing wrong, but because the formulas had not been built for her skin. Grades V and Vic I on the Fitzpatrick scale, shades the industry had been quietly setting aside for decades. She stood there for 43 minutes, then she went home and began learning how to fix it herself. She did not change her skin, she changed the formula. The first 3 years were the kind that you survive by not looking at them directly. A commercial kitchen rented by the hour, a sleep schedule held together by cold brew, and the particulars stubbornness of someone who had already decided that failure was not an option worth examining. She reformulated the foundation range 4 times before it finally behaved the way she had always known it could. Stable at room temperature, compatible with every undertone she had tested, genuinely accurate on skin the industry had spent decades treating as a footnote. When the first order came in, 11 units, from a woman in Baltimore who had found her on Instagram, Simone sat in the storeroom for 4 minutes and did not move. Then she stood up, packed the boxes, and went back to work. 5 years later, Adeyemi Beauty had $2.3 million in retail sales and a live negotiation with Ravel Collective, 580 locations nationally, that would take the brand to a scale she had not yet fully let herself imagine. Simone was 31. She wore her father's bronze coin bracelet every day. She drank her coffee black, no sugar, usually cold by the time she remembered to pick it up. Kang Ji-hun had lived in Queens from the age of 9 in an apartment that smelled of soy sauce and fresh wall plaster and his father's aftershave. Kang Hyun-woo, a man who had built something from nothing and had a laugh that adjusted the temperature of any room he entered. When Ji-hun was 23, his father was killed by the man his father had trusted most. Ji-hun was in the building. He did not reach him in time. He has never said that sentence out loud. Madame Yeon-soo did not allow him to grieve as a son. Wag. Within 3 weeks of the funeral, she had begun teaching him the only lesson she knew that had ever kept anyone safe. The men who survive are the men no one can read. Wanting something out loud is the same as pointing at it for someone else to take. Ji-hun learned stillness the way other men learn a language. He practiced until he was fluent. By 36, not one person in his world had ever witnessed the version of him that noticed small things and kept them quietly, without once needing anyone to know. What? None of the people who worked alongside him understood. Not Victor Song, not Daniel Cho, not even Madame Yeon-soo, who had designed the whole architecture of what he had become, was what stillness actually cost. The version of Ji-hun that had existed before 23 still arrived sometimes in the smallest places. The way he moved a coffee cup 3 millimeters before he knew why he had moved it. The way he noticed which direction a person tilted their head when they were lying. The way he had learned, somewhere in the 13 years, that the things you refuse to name do not disappear. They wait. Tuesday, April 9th, 9:23 a.m., Imlay Street. Ji-hun arrived for a scheduled property inspection, a routine line in his operations manager's weekly report. He took the stairs to the 3rd floor. The building manager moved ahead. The lab door was already open. Inside, the low hum of a mixer at controlled speed. Warm shea butter and something sharper. Clean, antiseptic. A woman standing at the center bench, one hand on a thermometer, both eyes on the viscosity monitor. Behind her, the wall was covered in color swatches organized by undertone, each annotated in handwriting so dense it looked like a language she had invented herself. The annotations were not labels, they were arguments. Shade against formula, temperature against texture, each one a small decision that had been made, and then questioned and then made again. Ji-hun, who had spent 13 years learning to read rooms in under 4 seconds, stood at that doorway and took 8. She did not look up. "I need 9 more minutes," she said. "If you need to pass through, stay right." The second cabinet from the door has a sharp edge. Ji-hun raised one hand toward the building manager. "Wait." He stayed at the doorway. She was mid-emulsification, the critical phase where 2 opposing substances must be held at precisely the right temperature for precisely the right duration, or the entire batch is lost. There is no shortcut. There is no reset. Simone Adeyemi moved through it the way a surgeon moves through something that cannot be paused. She did not perform calm. She simply was. 8 minutes and 47 seconds later, she set the thermometer down, wrote 3 numbers on the clipboard, and turned. Ji-hun was still there. He was looking at the color wall. She had the brief impression he had been looking at it for longer than the moment required. Not the way a visitor examines something unfamiliar, but the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand without asking for an explanation. Before either of them could speak, footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate. Park Jin-soo walked in with the easy posture of a man who had never needed to knock. He looked at Simone. He had a smile built for conversations that only move in one direction. Miss Adeyemi, I believe we discussed last month. He had not finished turning when he saw the other man. Everything left Park Jin-soo's face at once, not gradually. All at once, the way a light goes out in another room. He said one word, Kang. Then he apologized to a point on the floor between his own shoes and the door. Then he was gone. The room was quiet. The rain against the windows was louder than it had been a minute before. Ji-hoon looked at Simone properly for the first time. Her hands were still. That was the thing that stayed with him. Not that she had managed to stay calm, but that her hands had made that decision before she did. He will not come back, Ji-hoon said. She wanted to ask how he could know that with such certainty. What came out was smaller. Thank you. He nodded. The minimum acknowledgement possible. He completed the inspection in 6 minutes without asking her to move or explain anything. He moved through the lab with the unhurried precision of someone who had inspected 1,000 spaces and had learned that the most important information was never what the space was supposed to be, but what it actually revealed about the person inside it. Before he left, he paused at the nearest clipboard on her bench. Read it for 3 seconds. Said nothing. She did not know he had memorized the brand name before he reached the stairwell. What no one in that building understood the Tuesday morning was that a health and safety filing for 34 Imlay Street would clear the city's full review process in 31 hours. A record, undocumented, going back to 2003. At 4:17 p.m. that same afternoon, across town, Victor Song opened his operations report and read the same line twice. What then? He made a note. The following day, Ji-hoon assigned Daniel Cho to monitor building conditions at 34 Imlay Street. He gave no reason. Daniel accepted the way he accepted most things from Ji-hoon, without questions, with the attention of a man who understood that the things left unexplained were usually the ones that mattered. Daniel began appearing on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He sat in the ground floor office with a thermos and a report and said very little. He noticed things. 2 weeks later, a Tuesday in May, a report from Simone's contracted quality assurance lab landed on her desk. It flagged her April production batch, valued at $34,000, as compromised. Instability in the emollient matrix, the report read. Recommended actions card, the lot. Simone read it once. She set it down. She did not sign the confirmation form. She called Rachel into the lab, put the original batch data on the whiteboard in 4 columns, and began working backward through the numbers. Ji-hoon arrived at 34 Imlay at 3 that afternoon for a ground floor logistics meeting. Daniel met him at the bottom of the stairs. Said nothing. Just looked up. Ji-hoon went upstairs. The lab door was open. Through it, Rachel and 2 production employees, standing in a loose semicircle around a whiteboard, watching Simone work through a temperature log with the methodical patience of someone sang dismantling a machine while explaining how each part had failed. Her handwriting moved fast. Her voice stayed level. Boom. The room was following her. Rooms follow people who rooms follow who already know the answer and are simply building the architecture so everyone else can see it. Ji-hoon stood at the door. No one invited him in. He did not leave. 47 minutes after she had started, Simone capped the marker. The batch had not failed because of the formula. The overnight cold chain had fluctuated 3.7 degrees Celsius against spec during a 6-hour delivery window. A logistics failure, not a chemistry failure. The formula was intact. The lot could be recovered if they began reprocessing within 4 hours. Rachel looked at the whiteboard, then at Simone. They have a certified lab, she said. But you did that in 47 minutes. Simone was already reaching for her jacket. Then we have 3 hours and 13 minutes left. She walked out. Both production employees followed without being asked. Ji-hun remained at the doorway a moment longer, looking at the 4 columns still on the whiteboard. The temperature log, the annotated margin notes, the precise arc of a $34,000 mistake located, named, and stopped before it could become permanent. By one person with a marker, in 47 minutes, through the kind of knowledge that does not come from a certification. On the way downstairs, Daniel noticed Ji-hoon took the steps more slowly than usual. The following week, Victor Song came to see Ji-hoon. He arrived with the ease of a man who had spent so long inside rooms that he had forgotten admission was something that could be revoked. He sat across from Ji-hoon's desk, placed a single sheet of paper on the surface between them, and made his case. A logistics project in the Hanshin district had been stalled by the opposition bloc on the council for 11 weeks. What was needed was leverage. Leverage could take many forms. A termination notice on a commercial lease at 34 Imlay Street, delivered to a tenant with no contractual protection against early termination, would produce exactly the kind of disruption the opposition found useful to observe. In exchange, the Hanshin project would clear before Friday. He had framed it cleanly. He had done the arithmetic. He waited. Ji-hun looked at the sheet. He looked at Victor Song, Alec. In the silence that followed, he considered, briefly and completely, what the proposal revealed about the man who had made it, not the proposal itself, but the assumption behind it, which was that Ji-hun's decisions were a function of calculation alone, that the woman in the lab on the 3rd floor of 34 Imlay was an asset class like any other, a line item to be repositioned if the math required it. He had known Victor for 13 years. He had not, until this moment, understood exactly how thoroughly Victor had misread him. He said nothing for 4 seconds. No, he said, one word. No explanation, no counteroffer. He pushed the sheet back across the desk and opened his laptop. Victor picked up the paper. He left without pressing further, because pressing further was not how he operated. He moved through patience, through recalculation, through finding the longer route around things that would not move when pushed directly. He was already recalculating before he reached the elevator. What Victor Song did not do on his way out of the building was consider the possibility that he had read Ji-hoon wrong. In 13 years of proximity, he had never had reason to revise that read. Ji-hoon was decisive, Ji-hoon was strategic. Ji-hoon made choices that served the organization's interests ahead of his own. These were facts. What Victor had failed to account for was the possibility that the interests had quietly reorganized themselves around something he had dismissed as a distraction, and that what he had just called a distraction was, to Ji-hoon, a line. The Wednesday. After that, daycare closed without notice. Daniel brought Maya. She was 5 years old with her father's face, and a way of looking at sealable that bypassed whatever surface they were presenting and landed directly underneath. She sat in the corner of the lab with a coloring book while Simone walked 2 new employees through the weekly batch review. The room carried the warm scent of shea butter and the waxy sweetness of crayons. Ji-hoon arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Maya looked up from her coloring book. She studied him the way children study things they have not yet learned they are not supposed to, openly, without apology for as long as she needed. Then she said, "You look sad, Beaut. My dad says the people who work the most are usually sense because they forgot why they started." The room did not go quiet. But the room was already quiet. But the shift of a sentence landing somewhere it was not expected to reach moved through the air, like a change in pressure. Ji-hoon stopped, not his feet. Something behind his face stopped. The line of his jaw set, and then 5 seconds of silence that no one in that room could name. While Maya turned calmly back to her coloring book, as though she had simply mentioned the weather. From across the lab, Simone Adeyemi saw all of it. She saw the 5 seconds. She saw the way his jaw held, and the way it released, and the way he looked at the coloring book for exactly 1 beat, too long before he looked away. Alec. She was a person who had spent her adult life reading small things, undertones in shades of brown that most people couldn't distinguish, temperature variations of less than 2 degrees. The precise moment a formula had stopped being stable. She knew what it looked like when something was working against its own surface. It was the first time she had seen something on his face that looked like a person rather than a position. That same week, Victor Song paid his first visit to Madame Yeon Soo Kang's apartment on the Upper West Side. He brought tea he knew she preferred, and a concern he had been carefully shaping into something that sounded like loyalty. He said nothing negative about Simone Adeyemi directly. He was far too careful for that. He simply asked questions. Measured, reasonable questions designed to leave marks without leaving fingerprints. Whether Madame Kang had met the woman, whether she understood the nature of the situation, whether she thought this kind of distraction was wise, given everything Ji-hoon was responsible for. He left space after Iruichsashan. He let Madame Kang's own fears fill the gaps. He had learned over many years that the most durable doubts are the ones a person grows themselves. He left after 40 minutes. He left the questions behind. What none of them understood that week was that Victor Song had already made a second move. A quiet call to an intermediary with a contact at Revel Collective's vendor relations department. He had said nothing false, would be Alec Hans. He'd only raised a question, with apparent concern, about whether the team had fully verified the supply chain stability of as a small independent brand currently in national placement negotiations. One question, placed carefully, left to work. The Revel Collective deal did not fall apart. It simply stopped moving. Emails from Simone's team went unanswered for days, then a week. The timeline disappeared without explanation. Node? No one at Revel said no. No one said anything at all. Simone noticed what silence felt like when it came from a direction that had been warm the week before. She had been in business long enough to understand the difference between a delay and an absence. She wrote the 8th email anyway, because she was the kind of person who sent the 8th email. And then she closed her laptop and stood at the window of the lab for 3 minutes without seeing what was in front of her. Then she went back to work. The silence from Revel lasted 11 days. Balak. She counted them not by checking her inbox. She had learned, somewhere in the second year of building the business, that refreshing an inbox was a way of outsourcing your anxiety to a machine. But by the particular weight that settled in the lab each morning, the way a problem you cannot solve yet sits differently in your body than a problem you have not yet encountered. Alec. She had been here before, not with Revel specifically, but with the particular loneliness of watching something you built be held at a distance by people who had the power to let it in. She had learned not to mistake the silence for an answer. She had not yet learned how not to feel it. In July, Rachel sent 3 links. She dropped them into the team chat at 9:14 with no message attached, which was how Rachel communicated things she wanted Simone to look at without making her feel she was being looked at. Simone read all 3 articles about Kang Industries before her second cup of coffee was cold. She sat with the information for 6 minutes. Then, she picked up her cup, found it empty, and set it back down. I've known since week 3, she said without looking up. I stayed because this space is the best I found in my budget. And because I'm not doing anything wrong. Rachel opened her mouth. I made this decision with full information, Simone said. Balak. Not with emotion. She went back to the batch report on her screen. There is a particular kind of resolve that belongs to a woman in her 30s who has already learned the difference between choosing with her eyes open and choosing with her heart. This was the first kind. Rachel recognized it and said nothing more. August, a Friday evening. Rain had been coming down since 4 o'clock. Simone's car would not start. She stood in the parking area at 34 Imlay Street with 7% battery left on her phone and a 12-block walk to the nearest subway entrance. She ran the calculation she had run 100 times before. Which problem to solve first? In what order with what she had? Ji-hun was leaving the building when he saw her. He knew, without deciding to know it, that she would decline if he offered. He understood this about her, the way he understood certain things about certain people, not from what they said, but from watching how they held themselves when the situation was not in their favor. He walked to where Daniel was standing near the door. "Make sure she gets home," he said. Then he walked to his own car. Simone did not hear what he said. She saw Daniel make one call. 15 minutes later, a car arrived. She accepted the ride because the alternative was impractical, and she was 31 years old and had learned the difference between pride and stubbornness. Seaburn. On the drive home, headlights stayed behind them for 38 minutes. They did not turn off until she was inside her building. She did not call to ask. She locked her door, changed out of her wet jacket, and stood at the window for a moment before crossing to the lamp. Hunli Nat. She left it on longer than she needed to? She did not examine why. The following Wednesday, Ji-hun came to the building for a meeting that finished at 9. He stayed after. It was not something he had planned. He did not leave when the meeting ended, and found himself 20 minutes later at the top of the stairs, where the light under Simone's office door was the only light still on. But he knocked once. She looked up from her laptop, the expression of someone on her 8th unanswered email to the same address. Focused, composed, and very quietly exhausted in the way that only shows at the edges. He sat in the chair across from her. It was the first time he had sat in that office. A few minutes passed in the comfortable silence that requires something to have already been built before it can exist. "Is there no one waiting at home on Friday evenings?" he asked. She looked at him. Alec. The questions was direct enough to be honest and quiet enough to be careful. She was silent long enough that the answer was already clear. "There was someone," she said. "He left the year I lost my first distribution contract. He said I couldn't build a life with someone who never stopped building." She looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, at the bronze coin that had been her father's. "I didn't stop." Ji-hun said nothing for a moment. Outside, the building was quiet. The last of the production equipment had powered down an hour ago, and the floor had the particular stillness of a place that works hard and rests harder. He looked at her hands, which were folded on the desk, at the bracelet, at the way she was looking at it, not with grief exactly, but with the kind of familiarity that comes from having carried something long enough that it becomes part of your own weight.
What?
"Neither did I," he said. "It could have meant work." Both of them understood it did not only mean work. There was a pause after that. Not an awkward one, not the kind that needed to be filled. The kind that meant something had been said that did not need to be repeated, and both of them understood that too. The week after, Maya came again. She settled beside Simone's workstation this time, not in the corner, but close, the way children position themselves when they have decided someone is safe. She watched Simone mix a color sample with the full attention of someone who had not yet learned to pretend they were not watching. Ji-hun arrived at 2:15. Maya turned to look at him in the doorway. Then she looked at Simone's back, then at Ji-hun again. She seemed to be completing a calculation. "She's like my mom used to be," Maya said. "My mom always knew what to do when everyone else was scared. A beat." "You're looking at her again." She stood across the room and took Ji-hun's hand, without asking, without hesitating, and pulled him gently toward the door. "Come see, she's really good." Ji-hun did not pull his hand back. He stood at the threshold of the room, held by a 5-year-old who had walked across the floor with the full authority of someone delivering a long overdue verdict, and he did not move to leave. 3 seconds. 4. Long enough that Daniel from the corridor behind them looked away. From her workbench, back turned, Simone heard everything. The soft scrape of small shoes on concrete, the particular silence of Ji-hun not speaking. Her stirring slowed, half a rotation, barely. Not enough for anyone to see. Except she noticed. 3 days later, Madame Yeon-soo called Ji-hun. She had been thinking, she said, she would like to meet the woman from the building. Just dinner. Thursday evening, 7:30 at the Meridian private room. She had already made the reservation. Ji-hun had not mentioned which building, or that there was a woman. Victor Song had visited her apartment twice since May. That same day, Victor filed an emergency agenda item, with the council requiring immediate review. The meeting, Thursday evening. 7 p.m. sharp. That night, at 11:47, Ji-hun opened YouTube on his phone and typed a name into the search bar. Alec. He found a video from 5 years ago, low production quality, natural window light. Simone in a plain dark shirt talking about a 19-year-old girl who had stood at a cosmetics counter for 43 minutes and decided to fix something no one else had bothered to fix. He watched it to the end. Then he watched it again. What no one understood that week, not Daniel, who noticed the calendar conflict and filed it away, not Madame Yeon-soo, who believed the dinner invitation was entirely her own idea, was that Victor Song had spent 11 weeks and 3 things on the same Thursday night. A family dinner at 7:30, a council meeting at 7, and something else at 9 at 34 Imlay Street, something that would ensure Ji-hun had to choose between all 3 at once. He had not accounted for the fact that Ji-hun could read a schedule. The attack was the first thing, not the first thing Victor Song had arranged for that Thursday evening, but the first thing designed to reach Ji-hun before he could reach the room. Earlier that evening, while Simone was still at her desk, the first reply from Ravel Collective's vendor team had arrived at last, and she needed to read it before anything else. 3 men entered 34 Imlay Street through the freight entrance on the ground floor. She heard the stairwell before she saw anything. She had learned, a long time ago, that certain sounds are not ambiguous. Simone locked the inner lab door, called 911. Then she did what she had learned in a community safety course 3 years earlier. She pressed her phone's flashlight against the wire glass panel of the door and pulsed it in a slow, deliberate pattern. Not SOS, not panic, a signal that said, "I am here. I know what I am doing. Someone can see this door." Police arrived in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. She walked out with her hands visible and her back straight and gave the responding officers everything she had: times, entry point, descriptions, the approximate weight of footsteps on the stairs. She had promised herself, a long time ago, that she would not give fear a face it could use. She was speaking with her third officer when Daniel Cho appeared at the far end of the corridor. He looked at her, said nothing, stepped back and made a call. Ji-hun was in the council chamber at 40 Exchange Place. 7 minutes into the agenda Victor had filed that morning, when his phone vibrated once on the table. He looked at the screen. 2 words and a period. 34 Imlay. He stood up. He did not apologize. He did not explain to the 9 people at the table why the vote they had convened for would have to wait. He left. The door closed behind him with exactly the right amount of control to tell the room everything it needed to know about what came next. He arrived at 34 Imlay 11 minutes later. Simone was in the corridor outside the lab, standing with a detective, giving her account in a tone so even that 2 of the responding officers had quietly stopped what they were doing to listen. Her hands were at her sides. Her voice did not waver once. And standing at the entrance of 34 Imlay Street and watching Simone Adeyemi give a quiet, methodical account of what had been done to her were the first thing in 13 years he could not completely manage. He watched until the detective finished writing. He watched Simone sign the form. He watched her hand the pen back without looking down. Then, he got in the car and drove to Midtown. The Meridian private room had been in progress for 1 hour and 23 minutes when Ji-hun stepped off the elevator on the 47th floor. He was 17 minutes earlier than expected, not relative to the dinner which had begun without him, but relative to the time his mother had been told to expect him. The council meeting was supposed to run until 8:10. He had left it 7 minutes in. He did not need to ask anyone what had happened. He could read a room from a doorway, and what this room was carrying, and what this carrying. 24 people arrested in mid-motion. A string quartet that had stopped in the middle of a phrase. A water glass placed down too carefully on white linen. told him everything before he had crossed the threshold. He moved through the room the way he moved through most things, without hurry, without announcement. He placed one hand on the back of Simone's chair. Then he looked at his mother. "Say that again," he said. "I want to be certain I heard you correctly." What followed did not look like a confrontation. That was the thing 24 people would later struggle to describe. That none of it looked like what it was. Alec. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anything. He laid it out the way he laid out every decision he had ever made. Plainly, without theater, with the particular calm of a man who has been waiting for the right room for a very long time. He placed a folder on the table. 6 years of redirected financial transfers. Victor Song's name on 41 separate transactions drawn from the organization's operating accounts. The amounts were precise. The dates were precise. The receiving accounts, layered, offshore, patient, were precise. There was no room inside the documentation for interpretation. The room went still in a way that was different from how it had gone still before. He set his phone on the table and pressed play. Victor Song's voice entered the room. Unhurried, organized, specific. The call had been made 48 hours earlier to the man who had arranged for 3 people to walk into 34 Imlay Street that same evening. Address. Entry point. Timing. All of it in the voice of a man who believed the room he was currently sitting in would never hear it. Victor Song's fingers on the table did not move. Ji-hun spoke one more time, in the same register, the one that cost him nothing, and held everything. He told the room what Daniel Cho had spent 13 years helping him build toward. That Victor Song had provided the location of Kong Hyun-woo to the man who killed him. That the trust that had made the family vulnerable on that night had been constructed, carefully, by someone already inside it. That every year Victor had sat in their rooms and participated in their decisions, he had been sitting inside a house he had helped destroy. Daniel Cho from the far wall confirmed it. Detail by detail, the silence that followed each confirmation was the kind that does not invite a response. Victor said nothing, bored. He had spent 13 years building a particular version of himself inside this family's rooms. It did not survive the telling. There was nowhere left in that room for him to stand. Ji-hun turned to Simone and said, in the same voice he had used for all of it, measured, clear, and loud enough that 24 people would carry it out of that room and never mistake what they had heard. "I intend to marry her. Not quietly, not eventually. I am telling you now, in front of everyone you would have had witness her humiliation. Because I will not build a life with her in whispers the way this family taught me to build everything else." The plot and the love story arrived at the same sentence because they had never actually been 2 different stories. Victor Song was removed from the council within 48 hours. A federal investigation opened the following week, racketeering. Conspiracy accessory to homicide. His accounts were frozen within 30 days. $4.7 million, held pending proceedings that his attorneys would spend the next 2 years attempting to delay. His name stopped being spoken in the rooms he had spent his life arranging to be inside. Simone received an email from Ravel's vendor team. Apologetic, brief, a delay now resolved. She did not know what had cleared. She did not ask. She signed the distribution agreement in November. $1.1 million, 580 locations. Her name on a contract that would put a Adeyemi Beauty on shelves from Portland to Miami. Ji-hun did not mention his involvement. He never would. 3 days after the dinner at the Meridian, Madame Yeon Soo-kang came to Simone's apartment. She arrived at 3 in the afternoon on a Monday, without calling ahead. Simone opened the door and they looked at each other for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Madame Kang did not sit down right away. She stood in the middle of the apartment and looked around. The formula boards, the color samples by the window, the small wooden box on the bookshelf. Then she looked at Simone. In 1987, she began, without introduction, without ceremony. I worked the cosmetics counter at a Macy's in Paramus, New Jersey. My English had an accent that people found amusing. The floor manager told me that my complexion looked unprofessional. She said the word the way someone says a word they have been carrying for a long time. She suggested I use a foundation 2 shades lighter. I did. For 3 years. Simone did not speak. After that, my husband was killed. And I'd told myself for 13 years that it happened because I had loved him too loudly at the wrong time. She was quiet for a moment. I thought wanting something out loud was dangerous. It was the only lesson I knew. It was the lesson I had learned instead of a different one. She reached into her jacket pocket. She brought out 2 pieces of a small woven bracelet. The piece she had given Simone weeks earlier, and the matching half Simone had not known was missing. She placed both pieces into Simone's palm and closed Simone's fingers around them. I was not protecting Jihan from you, she said. I was protecting you from becoming me. She did not stay for tea. She picked up her bag and left, and the door closed quietly behind her, the Simone. And Simone stood alone in the middle of her apartment with the 2 halves of something in her hand, and the particular kind of silence that follows the arrival of something you did not know you had been waiting for. She stood there for a long time. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted, and the shadows on the formula boards changed shape. She was not thinking, exactly. She was holding what she had just been given, which was not only the bracelet, it was the information that the woman who had looked at her with that particular coldness had once been looked at the same way, and had carried that wound in a direction that cost her more than she had calculated. Simone had built a Diemi beauty for the 19-year-old standing at the counter. She had not known until that afternoon that the woman who humiliated her had once been that girl too. She did not forgive Madame Kang for what had been said in that dining room. Forgiveness was a longer process and a more private one. But she understood something new, and understanding was its own beginning. In November, Rachel was organizing Ha's photographs from the Adiemi Beauty pop-up event in June, the Williamsburg launch of the new foundation line. She sent Simone a folder of candid shots from the afternoon. Simone went through them slowly, the way she went through batch data, methodically, looking for things that mattered. She stopped on the 43rd image. In the back right corner of the crowd, behind a column, a man in a plain dark jacket, face turned toward the stage, watching, no one with him. He had come alone, and she checked the timestamp on the next image. It had stayed 40 minutes. Then the column was empty. She set her phone down on the workbench. She sat with that for a while. She did not call. She did not mention it. She simply understood something that had apparently been true for longer than she had realized. That he had watched her build the thing she had built in the same room where the women who needed it had held it in their hands and recognized themselves in it. And he had stayed for 40 minutes and left without telling her he had been there. Not because he was hiding it, because some things, she now knew, did not need to be announced to be real. The proposal happened the following October, on the 3rd floor landing outside the lab at the 34 Lab at 34 the Imlay Street. The rain was the same kind it had been on that first Tuesday in April, the kind that comes in sideways and makes the tin roof sound like something is trying to be heard. Jihan had come to the building for no specific reason, which was a thing he did occasionally now, without pretending. Otherwise, Simone was standing at the window at the end of the corridor, watching the water run down the glass. He came to stand beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. The rain against the roof, the particular smell of an old building getting wet, concrete and rust and something under it, older, the smell of decades. Somewhere 2 floors below, the freight entrance rattled once in the wind. The same entrance 3 men had come through 14 months ago on a Thursday evening, when everything in this building had been used as a reason for something, and all of them had come through it differently on the other side. The building had been quiet since then. The building had been, in its way theirs, the particular smell of an old building getting wet, concrete and rust and something under it. Older, they had stood in rooms like this before, the 2 of them, in comfortable silence. They were good at it. It was, Simone thought, one of the things she had not expected, Not that he was capable of warmth. She had understood that early, through the way he handled a coloring book left in the corner of a lab, but that he was capable of quiet that felt full instead of empty. He took her hand, the one that wore her father's bracelet. He turned to face her. "The 19-year-old who stood in front of a counter for 43 minutes, he said. The person who did not stop when someone told her she should. The woman who sat in a room with 24 people and did not give them what they were waiting for." He stopped. Then, "I spent my whole life being taught that wanting something out loud is the same as losing it." A pause that held everything the story had been building toward. "I am done being taught that. I want you." She said yes before he had technically finished asking. It was raining. The tin roof was loud. No one else was in the building. 4 years later. A Sunday morning in a kitchen that smelled of two childhoods at once, shea butter and sesame oil. The coffee Simone drank cold. The tea Jihun had started drinking without announcing it. Maya, who was 9 now, was teaching Madame Yeonsu Kang how to pronounce a word in Twi. The word was Akwaba. Welcome? B. Madame Kang kept placing the stress on the wrong syllable. Maya corrected her each time with the patience of someone who had decided this person was worth the effort. She did not pretend it wasn't funny when it kept being wrong. Madame Kang did not ask her to. Rachel's laugh carried in from the next room. Ji-hun was at the stove. He had started cooking on Sundays at some point in the first year of their marriage, not announced. Mind, just present one morning. Already familiar with where the good pan was kept and what temperature Simone liked her eggs. He had the specific competence of someone who learned things privately, without ceremony, and then simply knew them. He moved through the kitchen the way he moved through most spaces, without taking up more room than necessary, without broadcasting that he was there. Maya had once asked him why he never told people when he had done something. He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because the doing is the point." Maya had thought about that for 3 days and then reported back that she had decided he was right, which had made Daniel laugh for approximately 40 seconds in the hallway. Balak. On the kitchen shelf, between a jar of spices and a small ceramic vaser Ji-hun had bought in a market in Accra the previous spring, there was a bottle of Adiemi Beauty Foundation in warm dusk too. It had been there for 8 months. No one had mentioned it. No one needed to. Some things do not need to be named to be understood. A bottle of foundation on a shelf is a bottle of foundation on a shelf. It is also, depending on who put it there and what it cost them to put it there, a whole long conversation that two people had over the course of 2 years and multiple silences and one dining room at a Monday afternoon in September when a woman arrived, without calling ahead. Madame Kang had not commented on the shade range. She had not asked where Simone had sourced it. She had simply, one Tuesday, run out of the foundation she had been using for 15 years and reached for the one on the shelf. Simone was pouring coffee when she looked up and caught Ji-hun's eyes across the kitchen. The distance between them was 4 meters and a whole loud, lived-in life. The look lasted a second longer than it needed to. In it, she found the same thing she had found on a rainy Tuesday in April, in a third-floor room that smelled of shea butter and ethyl ester, when a man she had never met stayed at a doorway for 8 minutes and 47 seconds because she had asked him to wait. Chosen, not in spite of anything. Chosen completely, on purpose, every single day since. That is where we leave them, not because the story is over, but because some stories do not need an ending so much as they need a place quiet enough to finally rest. Tell me what stayed with you. Was it a 5-year-old who said in 12 words what the adults had been circling around for months? Was it a woman who sat in front of 24 people expecting her to break and chose not to give them that? Or was it a mother who spent 40 years building walls to protect the people she loved? Only to realize, just in time, that the walls had become the thing keeping love out? This is not only a love story. Simone built Adiemi Beauty because the world told her she wasn't the right shape for beauty, and then she sat in a room where someone used that same logic as a weapon. She did not move. She waited. because she had learned what the industry never taught, but life always does. That the standards people use to exclude you are often the ones you'll use to build your own way in. In a man who waited at a doorway for 9 minutes, in a mother who put down 40 years of armor to hold someone's hand, in a little girl who told a grown man the truth, there is something in all of it worth carrying. Drop a DM below. Which moment will you remember longest? And if someone you know has been told they don't belong in what they built, share this with them. Like if this story found something in you. Subscribe so you're here when the next one arrives. Until then, take up the space you earned, every single inch of it.